They stood her at the front of the church and told her she was no longer welcome at any table in the district. Not her sisters, not her own sons, not the Lord's. It was a Sunday in October of 1876 in a farmhouse turned meeting room in Elkhart County, Indiana. And the room was silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone in it already knows what's coming and no one wants to be the one who moves first. Magdalena Kaufman stood alone in the middle of the floor in her black Sunday dress in front of 200 people she had known her whole life, and listened to the bishop read the words that put her in the ban. After that morning, no member of that church could sit at a table with her, take a meal from her hand, or buy from her or sell to her, or treat with her in the ordinary daily business of a farm community. Not until she confessed and was restored. Her own grown son sat 6 rows back with his hat in his lap and did not raise his eyes. She walked home alone that afternoon, past neighbors who found urgent business with their harness straps and their children's coats rather than look at her on the road. 18 months later, some of those same people would walk up that same road in the worst planting crisis their district had seen in a generation, and stand outside her door, hats in hand, to ask her for the one thing that stood between them and a ruined year. Stay with me. I am going to tell you what she had hidden in that cellar, and why the very thing that got her banished from her own church was the thing that church could not do without. To understand what happened in that farmhouse in October of 1876, you have to understand that Magdalena Kaufman was not banished over seed corn. Nobody in that room that day would have called seed corn a sin. She was banished over a much older and much harder question that was tearing at Amish communities all through that decade, from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Indiana. And it very nearly tore her own district apart along with her. For most of the 1860s and 1870s, ministers from Amish congregations across half a dozen states had been meeting, year after year, in what they called the Dienerversammlungen, the ministers' meetings, trying to settle a question that would not settle. How strict should the ban be? When a member left one Amish congregation for another, gentler one, or married outside the fold, or simply drifted toward the more progressive Mennonite meeting houses springing up on every side, should the home congregation shun them entirely, refuse them at the table, refuse them in business, treat them as the world treats a stranger? Or was that too hard a thing to ask of a mother, a brother, a wife? There was no single answer, and there would not be one for years yet. Some congregations held the line hard, some let it go soft, and in the meantime, real families were left standing in the gap between those two answers, and Magdalena Kaufman's was one of them. Her husband Eli had died in the spring of 1876, only 38 years old, of a fever that took him in 9 days. Eli's parents, old Christian and Barbara Kaufman, had left their home congregation some years before. Not in scandal, not in any dramatic break, but quietly, over time, drawn to a meeting house a few miles off that held the gentler view of things. That did not believe a family should be made strangers to each other over which side of a fence they worshipped on. Eli himself had stayed in his home church out of duty to the community he'd grown up farming beside, but he had never stopped driving over to his parents' place on a Sunday afternoon. Never stopped sitting at their table. And when he died, it was his mother Barbara who sat up with Magdalena through the worst of that week and helped her wash and dress him for burial. The bishop of Magdalena's home congregation, a serious, careful man named Jonas Weaver, genuinely believed something. And it is worth saying plainly that he did believe it, not as cruelty, but as conviction, that a congregation which let its members drift back and forth across that line without consequence would not survive as a congregation at all. He asked her, gently at first, to formally set the example the whole district needed. Her husband was gone. She was a widow now, head of her own household, free to choose her own course. And if she would declare before the church that she would no longer eat at Christian and Barbara Kaufman's table, no longer receive them at hers, no longer do business with the family that had left the strict line, it would settle in one clean stroke a question the whole district had been arguing about for a decade. Magdalena said no, not out of rebellion. She told Bishop Weaver, and she meant it, that she had no quarrel with the church and no wish to leave it. She only could not do the one thing he was asking. Barbara Kaufman had held her hand through her husband's death. She was not going to be told, on top of losing Eli, that she must also lose his mother. Bishop Weaver gave her the rest of that summer to reconsider. She did not. And in October, with real regret on his face, people who were there that day say as much, that it did not look like a man taking pleasure in his work. He read her into the ban. Now, here is where the seed corn comes into it, and here is why I wanted to tell you this story at all. Among the things Barbara Kaufman had given Magdalena, years before at her wedding to Eli, was a small sack of corn seed. It was not fancy, and it was not much to look at. Small, hard, deep yellow kernels, an ear a little shorter than what some of the newer catalog varieties were producing. But it was Barbara's own mother's corn, and her mother's mothers before that, kept and replanted and quietly reselected on that same family's ground for the better part of 60 years, year by year, season by season. The way corn had always been kept before there was any other way to keep it. Every fall, Barbara, and her mother before her, and now Magdalena after her, walked the standing corn before the general harvest, and picked out by eye and by feel the handful of ears that had come in soundest and earliest and driest, the ones that had stood up straightest against a hard wind, and set those aside, whole, on the rafters of a dry corn crib, to be next year's seed. Nothing scientific was written down about it because there was no science yet to write. It was simply 60 years of one family quietly keeping the best of what the land gave them and feeding it back into the ground the next spring, over and over until the corn in that particular stretch of Elkhart County ground had grown, in a manner of speaking, to fit each other. That corn ripened early. That was the whole of what anyone could have told you about it in 1876 if you had asked, and nobody thought to ask, because in an ordinary year it did not matter. In an ordinary year the corn had all September and most of October to finish drying in the field, and whether a man's variety matured in late August or the middle of September made no difference at all to the size of his crib come November. Meanwhile, through the early 1870s, a different kind of corn had been finding its way into Elkhart County. Bigger-eared, heavier-yielding varieties, sold through the new seed houses that were beginning to advertise in the farm papers, bred out east for size and uniformity of ear. The kind of corn a minister with an eye on progress could point to at a threshing and call an improvement. Christian Yoder, one of the district's most respected farmers and a minister himself, had been buying and planting one of these newer varieties for 3 seasons running by 1876, and had been encouraging his neighbors to do the same, in the same spirit, modest, sensible, forward-looking, that had led the district toward the stricter line on the ban that same year. A uniform seed from a trusted outside source, planted the same way on every farm. It was, in its own small agricultural way, the same idea as the stricter discipline. One good standard, held by everybody, instead of a dozen old family lines each doing its own thing on its own ground. It was a reasonable thing to want. It very nearly worked, and it is worth saying that Christian Yoder was not a fool for wanting it, any more than Jonas Weaver was cruel for wanting a settled line on the ban. Both men were reaching, in their own way, for the same thing: order, and a district that held together instead of drifting apart into a dozen private customs. The trouble was that a field of corn does not know anything about order. It only knows its own ground and its own season, and the new corn, for all its heavier ears, had been bred on ground 300 miles south and east, on a longer, gentler season than Elkhart County's. And it wanted more of that season than Elkhart County reliably gave it. Magdalena Banished kept farming. That is a detail people tend to skip past when they tell this story. and it should not be skipped past, because it is the plainest fact in the whole account. Being put in the band did not mean her land stopped needing to be worked, or her son stopped needing to eat, or the season stopped turning. It meant her neighbors would not sit at her table and would not do business with her, which was its own long, grinding hardship. I will come back to what that actually looked like day to day, because it was harder than a sentence like that makes it sound, but it did not excuse her from a single row of corn. So that spring of 1877, alone on her own ground with her 2 younger sons, she planted the same seed corn Barbara Kaufman had given her at her wedding, the way she had planted it every year of her marriage, because it was what she had, and because, if I am honest with you, I think by that point it had become one of the last threads still tying her to Eli, and to a household that no longer had a husband in it. She was not thinking about frost dates. She was thinking about her mother-in-law's hands sorting ears on a corn crib floor the year she was married. I want to take a moment here and tell you plainly what living under the ban actually meant for a widow alone with 2 sons on a farm in 1877, because it is easy to hear shunned and picture something abstract, and it was not abstract at all. It meant that when her wagon needed a wheel repaired, the wheelwright, a member of her own church, could not take her money or do the work without risking the same discipline himself, and she had to find an outside tradesman in town at greater cost for work a neighbor half a mile off could have done in an afternoon. It meant that at the fall threshing, when every other farm in the district pooled labor and machinery and moved crew to crew, her fields went to the back of no one's list, because no one could be seen helping her without answering to the bishop for it. It meant her own son, the one who had sat 6 rows back with his hat in his lap, could visit her. The discipline of that era generally allowed a child to see a shunned parent, but could not eat a meal at her table while he was there. And so mother and grown son sat in the same room on visits that whole year and did not share food, which is a strange and particular kind of loneliness that does not show up in the church record at all. It was not violence. It was not shouting. It was 1,000 small, ordinary doors, quietly and consistently not open to her for a year and a half, by people who mostly still loved her and mostly still believed they were doing right. She bore it. She kept the farm going with her 2 sons, and she kept the corn. And she waited, the way a woman waits when she believes the thing she is being asked to do is genuinely wrong and cannot make herself do it, whatever it costs her. Then came the fall of 1877. The killing frost arrived early that year, the 2nd week of September, hard and sudden, the kind of frost nobody in the district had seen that soon in a decade. And what it caught, across nearly every farm that had planted Christian Yoder's improved corn, was a crop that was nowhere near ready for it. That heavier, later maturing variety, bred for a longer season than Elkhart County had actually given it that particular year, still stood green and milky in the ear when the frost came down. A hard freeze on corn that has not yet dried and dented does something specific and irreversible. It stops the kernel exactly where it is, locks the moisture in, and what should have gone on to become hard, dry, viable seed instead sits wet and soft on the cob through the fall and rots. You cannot save seed from frozen green corn. You can maybe still feed some of it to hogs if you get to it before the mold does. You cannot plant it come spring, because there is nothing alive left inside those kernels to plant. Farm after farm in that district opened its corn cribs that November to the same discovery. The ears were there. The bushels were there, in a rough, sorry way, fit for feed if you were careful and quick about it. But sound seed corn, good, dry, alive, plantable seed corn, there was almost none of it left in the whole district, because almost the whole district had been standing in the same field, so to speak, planted to the same variety, caught by the same frost, on the same week. Magdalena Kaufman's corn had already been in the crib and drying for the better part of 3 weeks when that frost came. That was the whole of it, And it was not luck exactly, though it looked like luck to everyone who did not know the corn's history. It was 60 years of Barbara Kaufman's family quietly favoring the ears that came in earliest, season after season, on that exact stretch of ground, until the corn itself had learned, in the only way a plant can learn anything, to hurry. It was old and short and unimpressive next to Christian Yoder's big improved ears, and it was also the only seed corn standing in that district, that November, that had finished its work before the frost found it. Word of it got around the way word always does in a farm community, quietly and completely, within about a week. And here's where I want to be honest with you about how this part of the story actually goes, because it is not the tidy ending you might expect, and I think it is more worth hearing for that. Nobody rode up Magdalena Kaufman's lane in a single dramatic moment to beg forgiveness. What happened was slower and more awkward than that. And it started, of all people, with her own son, who went to Bishop Weaver directly and asked him plainly what a district under discipline was supposed to do about a seed shortage, when the only sound seed left belonged to a woman under the ban. It was not a simple question for Jonas Weaver, and to his credit, he did not pretend it was. The discipline existed to hold the church together, not to starve it. And a spring with no corn to plant was not an abstract theological problem. It was hunger the following winter, for every family in that district, his own included. He rode out to see her himself that December, the first member of the congregation to sit down across from Magdalena Kaufman's table since the previous October. Though, and this detail matters, and it is true to how these things generally went, he did not eat with her. He sat, and he talked, and he asked her, on behalf of the district, whether she would sell them seed corn for the spring, and Magdalena said yes before he had finished asking, because whatever she thought of the ban, she had never once wanted her neighbors to go hungry over it. She sold it at an ordinary fair price, no more. She did not use it as leverage. She did not demand her restoration as the cost of the corn, though she would have been within her rights by any reasonable measure to ask for exactly that. She simply sold seed corn to a district that needed it, the way she would have any other year, and let the rest sort itself out on its own time. And it did sort itself out, though slowly, and not because of the corn alone. The corn made the conversation possible again. It put Jonas Weaver back at her table, even if he could not yet eat there. And it put the whole district in the position of needing something only she could give them, which has a way of softening even a genuinely held conviction. But it was the larger argument, the one that had been running through those ministers' meetings for 15 years, that finally settled the matter the following year, when the district's ministers, weighing the whole hard question of the ban one more time, came down closer to the gentler line than the strict one. In the spring of 1878, Magdalena Kaufman made her confession. Not, she always said afterward, a confession that she had been wrong to love her mother-in-law, but a confession made possible because the church itself had shifted enough ground to meet her part way, and she was restored to full fellowship and ate her first meal at another member's table in 18 months at her own son's house with Barbara Kaufman, who was by then permitted to be there too. I do not want to hand you a prettier ending than the truth will bear. So let me say plainly what this story is and is not. It is not a story about a church being cruel and a woman being right, full stop, the end. Jonas Weaver was not a villain. He was a man trying, in good faith, to hold together a community that really was at risk of coming apart at the seams over a question with no easy answer. In an era when a great many Amish congregations did come apart over exactly that question. Magdalena Kaufman was not a rebel. She never wanted to leave her church only to keep her mother-in-law. Both of them were caught, along with a great many real families across a great many real districts in that decade, in a hard argument that took the whole of the 1870s to work itself out. And that argument is, in fact, the reason there is a group known today as the Old Order Amish at all. The branch of that movement that settled, in those very years, on the stricter reading of the questions Bishop Weaver was wrestling with in 1876. What I can tell you plainly is what endured, because it is sitting in the ground of Elkhart County to this day, in a manner of speaking. Christian Yoder's improved corn, the big uniform catalog bred variety, is gone entirely. One hard frost was all it took to end it, and nobody replanted it once they'd seen what a single early September could do to a field that needed 6 more weeks it hadn't been given. Magdalena kept her mother-in-law's corn until she was an old woman, and taught the keeping of it to a granddaughter the way Barbara had taught it to her, ear by ear, on a corn crib floor. And something very like that same short, early, unglamorous corn is still, by more than one local account, sitting in seed corn kept by families in that part of Indiana a century and a half later. Not because anyone ever wrote it down as remarkable, but because it kept doing quietly, year after year, exactly the one thing it had always done. It came in early. It always had. And there was exactly one September when that was the only thing in the whole district that mattered. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments. And tell me about a time something small and unglamorous turned out to be the thing that actually mattered. There is more where this came from, the overlooked, the disciplined, and the ones the whole community ended up needing after all. What you have heard is a told story, shaped for the telling. The people and the specific district in it are invented. The Diener Versammlungen of 1862 to 1878, the real and painful divisions those meetings reflect within Amish communities of that era, over the strictness of church discipline, and the historical reality that this period produced the branch known today as the Old Order Amish, are not. Nor is the basic agricultural fact underneath the story. A locally adapted seed line kept and reselected on one piece of ground across generations will often weather a hard local season that an outside, uniformly bred variety cannot.